century after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the federal government just released thousands of documents surrounding his killing. I'm Scripps News' Holly Furfer. You're watching Morning Rush. This all comes despite pushback from his family, and now his daughter, Bernice King, is calling for the Trump administration to release the Epstein files. Scripps News legal affairs correspondent Avajoy Burnett has been digging into those docs and joins us live in our D.C. newsroom. And Avajoy, all right, tell us more about these newly unsealed records and just how the King family members are reacting today.
Hey there, Holly. Those documents are massive. There's so many of the documents. Some estimates put them at around 230,000. There are estimates that are even higher, closer to 240,000. These are newly unsealed records regarding the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. more than a half a century ago, 57 years ago. And now, according to the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, these files should reveal more information. For example, more on the investigation from the FBI, and then also more details about James Earl Ray. This is the person who pleaded guilty to the assassination of Dr. King more than 50 years ago. But then it's also important to note that that person later recanted that statement and kept his innocence, proclaimed his innocence until he passed away in 1998. But this release, Holly, it is extremely controversial. We know that two of the surviving King children, they are against this. We saw that post on social media from Bernice King at the top of what you were mentioning earlier today. And they're really saying that this is something that could distract against what their father did as a civil rights icon back in the civil rights movement, doing so many things to help people who were underserved. You see a portion of the statement there, I believe. Yep, it's right there on the screen. This came from the King Center because they were anticipating the release of these documents. They didn't want for them to be released, but they were anticipating the release. I'm going to read a portion of what the surviving children wrote in that statement. They said, "While we support transparency and historical accountability, we object to any attacks on our father's legacy or attempts to weaponize it to spread falsehoods. We strongly condemn any attempts to misuse these documents in ways intended to undermine our father's legacy and the significant achievements of the movement." One of the concerns that many people who support Dr. King have is that these documents may highlight some of his extramarital affairs instead of focusing on the fact that he did so many things to advance the civil rights movement. And then also to kind of not look at the fact that the FBI director at the time used illegal wiretaps in order to spy on Dr. King. But there is some division within the King family itself. For example, last night or yesterday, Attorney General Pam Bondi, she posted a picture on social media ahead of the release of these documents with Dr. Elvita King. Dr. Elvita King is the niece of Dr. Martin Luther King, and she said she is pleased that these documents are being released. So clearly that is something that is very different from what the King children are saying. And then we also heard from the Director of National Intelligence, once again, Tulsi Gabbard, and she was saying that this release is unprecedented, and it just shows that President Trump is standing by his promise of releasing a lot of these documents revolving around assassinations. We also know that earlier this year, assassination documents about JFK and RFK were released. Holly?
All right, Scripps News legal affairs correspondent Avajoy Burnett live in D.C. for us. Thank you for your analysis on this. And as we know, more than 6,000 files, as Avajoy said, totaling more than 230,000 pages relating to King's assassination, were published in the initial release. The National Archives said more files would be released as they are reviewed. Joining us now live is Dr. Jonathan Collins, Assistant Professor of Political Science and Education at Columbia University. Thank you so much for being here with us on Scripps News.
Oh, Holly, it's a pleasure.
All right, let's talk about this. 240,000 documents. That's a lot to go through, and it definitely will take a while. But do you expect we might learn anything that we don't already know or suspect?
Well, here's what's going on is, I've been combing through these documents. Other scholars, especially historical scholars, have been combing through these documents, and we have yet to see anything come to the surface that we didn't already know about Dr. King's assassination. These documents primarily detail information around James Earl Ray, the alleged killer, as well as information from the wiretaps that were initiated around Dr. King for the FBI, especially J. Edgar Hoover, then at the time leader of the FBI, to discern as much information as they could, not only just about Martin Luther King Jr.'s personal life, but they were trying to figure out as much as they could about his political movement that was happening around him.
And we know a lot of those wiretaps are not going to be released till 2027. So how much of this is a distraction for President Trump from the Epstein file controversy, and how much of this is truly a desire to put the truth out there and talk about transparency?
Well, if you look at the timing of this, it's hard not to see this as a distraction from the Epstein release saga. President Trump signed an executive order at the very beginning of his term in 2025 to have these files released. As has already been stated, the RFK and JFK files, which were a part of that same exact executive order, well, those files have already been released. Why are the MLK files suddenly being released right now? Right? We know that the name Martin Luther King generates so much discourse, is so much conversation, that it's going to be something that takes away from the headlines of previous days. And now the headlines of previous days have been what's going on with the Epstein files, because this is one of the areas where the political coalition that Trump has built, it's starting to fracture a bit. Half of Republicans are even dissatisfied with the way in which Trump has handled the release of the Epstein files. And so, this is one of the rare areas where we've seen, interestingly, bipartisan support for finding truth on this matter. And so Trump tries to reconstruct the narrative of, hey, we are engaging in truth and transparency here by releasing these King files. But what the public really wants to see is, when are we going to see these Epstein files released? Not just the transcript of the grand jury. When are we going to see the full collection of federal files?
And, we know that the goal of surveilling Dr. King was to discredit him and end the civil rights movement back at the time. Given that fact, how much of what we might learn do you suspect is actually accurate? I mean, could you deduce that some of this information, much of this information, could be skewed, given FBI agents wanting to please J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI then, and give him what he wanted?
Well, Holly, that's the major concern, is that if you look through the files, there's no context surrounding the files. So all we get is the information that is essentially given to us through the lens of the FBI. And the FBI at the time saw Martin Luther King Jr. as a threat to American public safety. Right? Within the files, we also see interviews that FBI members are conducting with foreign intelligence agencies, because they see Martin Luther King Jr. as this very, very dangerous threat. And so that idea of Dr. King as a threat to American safety is the lens through which these files are collected, reported, and a lot of the documentation is written. Even you think about the Poor People's Campaign, which was this major movement for economic equality in the U.S. If you look at the way in which it's discussed in the files, it's treated as essentially communism and a threat to undermine the capitalist order of American society. And so we have to be very careful when looking at these files and dissecting the information that comes through, because there is no context whatsoever that helps to understand King's legacy as it should be interpreted.
And from what you've read and learned throughout your career, I want to know your opinion. Do you think James Earl Ray was the lone shooter as he first confessed, or do you think that this really was a government conspiracy that went beyond Ray as he recanted in his later years?
I think we don't have enough information to make a conclusive decision there, but it's hard to not look at the situation and say, there's more than what meets the eye. And so, for instance, what's the motive that James Earl Ray has for executing this assassination? We know that he was somewhat radicalized while James Earl Ray was living in California. He was sort of following these white supremacist separatism, Jim Crow political movement. that was feeding into actually a national political campaign. And he became very politically active in racial separation. And so that political commitment could be very much enough to want to end the life of a man who stood for racial equality and racial justice. But then there are also questions as to, was he acting alone? And there has been subsequent information about potential allyships. There have been other testimonies suggesting that if James Earl Ray was indeed the killer, it wasn't just James Earl Ray acting in a sort of unilaterally, that there could have been mob involvement, that there could have been actual involvement from the Memphis police, that this is much bigger than just one man. And we don't have enough evidence to suggest that that's not the case. I'll put it that way.
Well, as we go through and comb through all these documentations, we hope that you will come back on Scripps News for more insight and analysis. Dr. Jonathan Collins, Assistant Professor of Political Science and Education at Columbia University, we appreciate your time today and hope to have you back soon.